250 years ago, in the Scottish Highlands, a lone hiker spotted a mysterious structure on top of a hill. John Williams was just taking a walk when he saw an ancient fort crowning the summit of Tupple North. The forts seemed to reflect light in odd patterns, and stones usually don't reflect light. So John decided to climb the hill and see for himself. What he found at the top defied any explanation, and it continues to baffle scientists even today. The rock formations on the top of the hill were melted. They looked like glass and not stones. In front of John stood Iron Age stone walls fused together by extreme heat. The rock formations were so melted that they looked like glass. The entire hill fort had been transformed into volcanic glass, vitrified. But here's the thing, there are no volcanoes in Scotland. It looked as if someone had taken a massive blowtorch to ancient stone. But this was in 1777. Blowtorches didn't exist. Industrial furnaces weren't invented yet either. And most importantly, the fort Williams found had been built over 2,000 years ago. Williams became obsessed. He spent the rest of his life trying to unravel this mystery. During his research, it became apparent that it wasn't just one fort. He discovered over 70 vitrified forts in Scotland alone, and across Europe, more than 150 forts, all turned to glass by some unknown ancient fire. I've been investigating this for a month, and what I found makes no sense. These rocks were exposed to levels of heat so high that they would melt modern steel. Levels of heat the Iron Age couldn't produce for sure. Yet someone did it, repeatedly, across continents, for centuries. For 250 years, scientists had two questions. How did they do it, and why? When scholars first studied these forts in the 1700s, they reached for natural explanations, volcanoes, lightning. Some even suggested dragons. But the simplest theory? It was that ancient builders found these glass rocks and used them to build a fort. Then, in 1780, the Royal Society of Edinburgh dropped a bombshell. Science figured out the glass wasn't natural. Humans did this. To turn Scottish rocks into glass requires 1200 degrees Celsius. At that temperature, stone melts like honey. Then it hardens into glass when it cools down. Today, we need industrial furnaces to reach these temperatures. In 500 BCE, the hottest thing available was a blacksmith's forge, and I doubt someone built a furnace big enough to fit an entire fort. An open fire could potentially reach 1000 degrees. If you have deep coals, forced air, and perfect conditions, it would reach that for a few seconds. But that's not nearly enough to melt stone. Besides, fire is hottest at the ground level, near the coals. But in reality, these walls were melted stories high, and not at the ground. Yet, here they are, over 60 confirmed vitrified forts around Scotland. At Tupple North, entire sections of the wall are turned to glass. When you tap them, they even ring like glass. Archaeologists who've spent decades studying these sites all agree on one thing, that this shouldn't be possible. Before I share my theories, let us first examine the mainstream explanation. It goes like this. These forts originally had timber frameworks filled with stone. When the fort was destroyed, either by enemies or ritually by its inhabitants, the burning timber created enough heat to partially melt the stones. That's all good on paper, but there's one big problem though. In 1980, archaeologist Ian Ralston attempted to test this theory. The experiment was filled for Arthur C. Clarke's Mysterious World. They built a section of wall using Iron Age techniques. Then, they piled it high with timber and set it ablaze. The fire burned for 22 hours. The team fed it constantly with fresh wood.
Within minutes of the fire being lit, the wood stacked on the outside is well alight. Weary helpers begin to realize the true extent of the mystery of the vitrified forts. To wonder not only how the fort builders could achieve the searing temperatures needed to melt the rock, but how they managed to drag vast quantities of wood up to the hilltops with only primitive transport. 22 hours after the fire was first lit, it's time to demolish the wall and see whether the stones at its core have melted. At first sight, the result looks disappointing. There are no ramparts of fused stone.
The maximum temperature achieved during the experiment was approximately 800 degrees Celsius. They needed at least 300 more to turn the stones into glass. We must conclude that simple burning of timber cannot account for the vitrification seen in Scottish hill forts. So if it wasn't just burning timber, what was it? For decades, researchers have wondered how these ancient people built walls of fused glass. But what if this was the wrong question? What if they didn't build them that way at all? When Professor Gordon Noble from the University of Aberdeen excavated Tupple North in Scotland, his team made a crucial discovery. Beneath the vitrified sections, they found evidence of earlier construction. Unburned stones, timber post holes, normal fortifications. This evidence suggests these forts lived two lives. First, as traditional hill forts, then something happened. The initial theories that the ancients vitrified the forts themselves during construction were entirely wrong. Carbon dating further strengthens this theory. At site after site, there's a gap, sometimes centuries, between when the fort was built and when it was vitrified. These weren't built as glass walls, they were built as normal forts occupied for generations, and then something happened and turned the stones to glass. According to Ian Ralston's extensive studies of vitrified forts, the vitrification patterns show clear signs of destruction rather than construction. The forts were already there, and something turned them to glass. So what are the main theories of how that happened? Theory 1 is that lightning strikes caused it. Some suggest repeated lightning strikes could generate the necessary heat. Lightning can indeed reach temperatures of 30,000 degrees Celsius, far more than what's needed for vitrification. But lightning leaves very distinctive marks. These marks are called fulgurites. They are hollow glass tubes formed when lightning strikes sand. And they don't appear in vitrified forts. And what are the odds of lightning striking precisely along the length of multiple walls at dozens of sites? We can dismiss this one easily. Theory 2 involves Greek fire. By the medieval period, the Byzantines had developed Greek fire, an incendiary weapon that burned on water and couldn't be extinguished. Some historians wondered, could the ancient Scots have possessed something similar to Greek fire? Greek fire indeed burned much hotter than wood, and it could potentially vitrify stones. So, what's the problem with this theory? Well, Greek fire was invented around 672 AD, nearly 1,000 years after most of these forts were already vitrified. And even Greek fire, fearsome as it was, burned at temperatures still a bit low for vitrification. Theory 3. Dragons. Yes, seriously. In the 1800s, before geology was fully understood, some antiquarians genuinely proposed that dragons might have melted these forts with their breath. I believe this one should be fairly easy to prove or debunk. If it was indeed a dragon that caused the vitrification, if dragons existed, the flames would have come from the sky and not from below. So I went through all the Scottish vitrified forts with the hope to debunk this one quite easily. But to my surprise, everywhere the melt starts not outside but inside the wall, and it doesn't start down the wall, but high up. Heat worked its way from the inside of the wall and downward from the top. The lower courses usually stay untouched, while the upper 2 feet and the stone packed around the timber beams turn glassy. Continuous bands of melt from the very bottom to the very top are rare. In short, yes, the fire always started at the top of the walls. Now, if anyone really attacked these forts and used fire in their assault, most of the vitrification would be on the outside walls. But in fact, the case is the opposite. The majority of flame marks are only on the inside of these forts. Something happened within these forts and not outside of them. So with a certainty of 99%, we could probably rule out dragons attacking these forts, unless the dragons were caged inside them. Well, we're left with two possibilities. Either something used extreme heat to break out of the forts, or the people who built them had access to a substance that could melt stone, and they used it intentionally. Given that the same pattern appears in over 70 locations, I lean toward the second option. This was deliberate and planned on a very large scale. I wish it were dragons too, but it makes no sense. Sorry guys. The most logical answer comes from the most unlikely source. Not from a laboratory or university, but from a local historian clearing weeds. He was helping clear out gorse, a thick bush that blankets Scottish hillsides. Like any practical Scot, he didn't want to waste time clearing bushes, so he burned them. But he found out gorse doesn't burn like normal wood. The pile seemed to burn inward, creating its own furnace. The smoke was sticky, oily, and the heat, it was more intense than anything he'd seen before. Gorse contains volatile oils and resins that create extreme heat when burned slowly. As it burns, it creates its own charcoal, which burns even hotter. In a compressed pile, temperatures can exceed 1000 degrees Celsius, and if we extract the oils and soak something else in them, it might reach higher. To our surprise, the whole of Scotland is covered in gorse. And suddenly, everything starts to make sense. Gorse has grown wild across Scotland for millennia. The Iron Age inhabitants would have dealt with it constantly, clearing it from fields, from around their settlements, from their fortifications even. As to why they burned their forts, after reading through everything on the subject, this is the theory I came up with. An unknown empire ruled these lands. We actually don't know who was the one that owned these forts. Then came revolution. The new rulers wanted every trace of the old power erased, so they organized something unprecedented: burning stone fortresses. Imagine waking up in 300 BC looking across Scotland and seeing the hilltops burning like giant glass furnaces. This was a power move. For example, Dunedin, one of the glass fortresses, isn't just any bump on the map. It sits on a volcanic plug that everyone in the plain can see. It's practically an Iron Age billboard. Radiocarbon and archaeomagnetic dates drop its big burns sometime between 390 and 160 BC. This is a time in which we know local tribal kings, probably the Texali, were fighting for turf. If you torch that summit, the whole valley watches the old walls melt, and they know exactly who's in charge now. To me, out of all the theories out there, this makes the most sense. As with most mysteries that echo through time, there is no way to really know for sure. I'm Xuisoko and thank you for watching Into the Unknown. If you like the ancient mysteries I share, make sure you check out my next video, which dives deeper into why ancient peoples might have been more advanced than history gives them credit for. See you there.